hands-on approach to banking. Also brought to you by our friends at Cole Roofing, where we are doing our Be More Positive community and charity series each and every Thursday. You want to get your charity spotlighted. We're going to do 200 of them this year, all with Howard Bank and Cole Roofing. Toss me an email, nasty@WNST.net. Also brought to you by our friends at Royal Farms. Real fresh, real fast. Make sure you're using the mobile app when you're gassing up. It'll save you some dough on some fried chicken and some Western fries. The only thing that makes the Western fries better at Rofo is when they're free. Royal Farms and the Royal Farms Arena, home of the Baltimore Brigade. And they play, go to BaltimoreBrigade.com and learn more about that. All right, now, I've got to sort of preface this as saying I've had this guy on the show once or twice. I know the legend of him as an old Houston Aller and a Pittsburgh brawler and an author and an NFL agent. And I see him on Twitter from time to time, and I'm about to welcome him in. But this is the first in-depth conversation that I've had with anyone who really knew Bruno Sammartino and was from the era and from that the Pittsburgh area where people would bump into Bruno. And I've been trying to chase some people down. I had Gary Michael Capetta on 2 weeks ago on the backside of the Andre the Giant HBO feature that Bill Simmons had done. And you know me, man, I'm a mark for wrestling and the WWE and anything that links the Grand Wizard and superstar Billy Graham together. And Ralph Cindrich, strangely enough, I think of him as an NFL agent and player and sometimes pundit, and he writes some cool stuff on Twitter from time to time and has written an interesting book and is about to do another book on representing athletes. But Ralph Cindrich, you come to me today as a Pittsburgher and a Yinzer and a real aficionado of all things, Bruno Sammartino, because I'm thinking that you were a kid on a hill up Mount Lebanon watching Bruno come into the Pittsburgh Civic Arena and try to do battle with any number of bad guys, in the 1960s and 70s. Am I right?
You're right. And although it wasn't in Mount Lebanon then, it was in little Lavella, Pennsylvania, but he was always on studio wrestling, and he was everyone's hero, and he conducted himself in such a high manner that, you could invite him anywhere. Unlike some, say, boxers. I was at a banquet with Fritzy Zivik, World Association or champion boxer, and it was at a Catholic banquet, and he said a couple of things that were a little embarrassing. Not with old Bruno. He was a guy that in Pittsburgh just revered. I got to know him when I went to the University of Pittsburgh. I was a wrestler, a collegiate wrestler, and did pretty well, but that had nothing. It was more football and going to the School for the Blind. And because I had some notoriety as a college player, I would be invited to the school, and Bruno would always be there, and they absolutely adored him. I mean, the kids would just swarm him all the time.
Now you're talking maybe like 66, 7, 8, 9 in that era, right?
Exactly.
So he had just beaten Buddy Rogers, and he was the champion of all champions at that point. And it was really before the circus kind of came to town in the 70s, right? Like, it was still wrestling in the 60s primarily, right?
Yes. But his career didn't start there in wrestling. You want to know when it started? It started back in the 50s, early 50s, when he was a construction worker at building the Pittsburgh Hilton. And a carnival came to town and it had an orangutan. And someone had to fight the orangutan, and he could make $25 if he beat the orangutan. And he went in there and he went after him, and this thing just beat the crap out of him. He could grab onto the ropes and it do things with its feet and whatever else. And he said his eyes were just bloodshot. And at the end, though, he got to make one last lunge, and he goes and he punches him in the stomach, and he gets disqualified and didn't get the money. But no matter what, later on in life, he'd say, "Yeah, but I wrestled an orangutan." He was embarrassed by it. But
I did not know that story. Now, like, and I know there's probably a million people saying I know that story. I just Googled it.
No, there aren't.
It's legendary. 1956. He wrestled an orangutan. I mean, this is why I'm putting you on, Cindrich. I didn't come here looking for Steelers lore. So you're a kid watching him wrestle on TV. You meet him, And you then knew him the rest of his life. And look, I know all the stories of the falling out, and George Saharian, and steroids, and where he stood on all that, and Anthony McMahon. And I had him on the show at various points to talk because he was such a gregarious man. I never met Bruno. I had him on the show 2 or 3 times, but I'm intimidated. You know, like when Bruno died last week, that's about as big a deal from my childhood when I think of who I was in 1975, 6, 7, 8, 9. Bruno was every bit the equal, if not bigger than Brooks Robinson, you know, for many of us who love professional wrestling, right?
Yes. Yeah, and you know, it was well deserved. I mean, he conducted himself in that manner. We don't have athletes like him today. You know, he'd talk about just the way wrestling when it came up, and what was going on with McMahon and with the whole enterprise when they were doing the first World Wrestling event that went on. And Bruno was embarrassed by it. He was embarrassed by the nudity. He was embarrassed by the language. You know, he said, you know, like he said, we all use it at some time, but there's a time and the place. And so for him, and it was real. You know, it was, you knew with him it wasn't a put on. You know, with some it could be a put on, but the guy had the values. And you know, he almost died as a kid a couple different times. One with the disease, and another one when his village was surrounded by Germans. If not for a party from his Italian town that went out and came back, if not for that party who came and protected them, killed the German soldiers, he would have been killed right there. So, you know, there's a story, but for me, he helped me one time. And, you know, geez, I mean, I don't know how many years, you know, you get separated. I had a client who I'm trying to use some leverage for in the NFL, and his name's Bill Fralic. And he's drafted the number 2 pick in the 1985 draft. And, you know, we're stuck in the mud with the Atlanta Falcons, and I need to get some type of leverage in some way. Well, Billy even received Heisman Trophy votes. I mean, he was like second or third as an offensive lineman. He was a guy, they had first time pancakes were established. Well, in any event, Billy was a heck of a high school wrestler, but going into the pros, you know, he still always liked pro wrestling and thought about it. And so what I did is...
Well, at that time, it was a lot of money in wrestling. You know, after Ernie the Big Cat Ladd and Wahoo McDaniel and those guys, that next generation, I mean, look at The Rock, right? I mean, you know, look at what he did there instead of playing football, right?
It was an option. You know, it wasn't the best option. You know, we could have signed with the Atlanta Falcons, but it was an option. But what I had to do is to make the option real. I invited Tom Bratz from the Atlanta Falcons, the general manager, into Pittsburgh. I had him meet downtown Pittsburgh at my brother's law firm, and had Bruno in there. Had Tom Bratz was going to meet me, and we were going to go out in the country, drink some beer, and do some fishing. But I had Bruno in there, and he went through it all. I mean, to try to just create that leverage to say, okay, yeah, this guy maybe goes to wrestling for a year or so, and he could easily make over six figures in one. Especially think about the PR that football players received at the time, and everything. And the draft was just really unfolding. The short of it all is because of Bruno, Fralic ended up with what was called, it's a landmark contract, never been done before in the NFL or after, and only done in baseball one time with Bobby Bonilla. And this was in 1985. It was called it's a Rabbi Trust, but it pays them $7.76 million. The first pick in the country, Bruce Smith, got something like $2.8 or $2.9 million. Fralic gets $150,000 every year for the rest of his life, every January. If he dies short of 40 years, his estate will receive the balance of $6 million. And it was one of those things that I couldn't have done, we couldn't have done without Bruno. But the rest of the story is and how it came about. Old Bratz and me go out to the country. We're drinking beer, and he ends up saying about 20 beers later or something, Iron Cities later, he says, we started doing the contract or signing the contract. And it was just one of those that, you know, Billy still receives the money, and it's doesn't happen without Bruno. And it's just, you know, there was no way I was big enough, well, Billy was, to do something like that, but it was Bruno on a friendship basis.
He is Ralph Cindrich. The book is NFL Brawler, a player turned agent's 40 years in the bloody trenches of the National Football League. You can go check that out. He's out of the fighting city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where we don't like any of them up there. I got no friends in Pittsburgh this week with the Capitals and the Penguins getting going, but he was a friend of Bruno Sammartino. So let me give you my background. I was born in 68, right? I'm an Aparicio, so I come from the baseball family on that side of things, and East Baltimore on the Gringo side. And in the 1970s, the Elliots, there were three kids that lived three doors down, Mark, Joe, and Pete, and they wrestled like they were like orangutans. They jumped around on the furniture and were doing swinging neck breakers and whatnot when Ken Patera was around, and Stan the Man Hansen and Stan Stasiak and all that. And my parents, old school Baltimore, they used to see Gorgeous George and the TV tapings, and my parents loved Bruno. My mom loved Bobo Brazil, Haystacks Calhoun, all those wrestlers from that era. And in the 70s, my parents had lost a son, and I was sort of a replacement child without realizing at that time. And I fell into wrestling, and my parents thought it was the greatest thing that I wanted to go to the wrestling matches in the mid-'70s. So in 1977, for the first time, I was 8 years old, and I had been to a lot of baseball games. I had been to a lot of Colts games, Ralph. I mean, I had seen you play with the Oilers. If you weren't on the 76 Oilers, but I saw Namath play at Memorial Stadium, Bradshaw, all that. Man, my dad took me to Colts games in 74, 5, 6. But my first wrestling match was Bruno and Stan Stasiak in March of 77, and then the next month was literally the night Bruno lost the championship. So the second night I ever went to professional wrestling was the night that superstar Billy Graham pinned Bruno, April 30th, 1977. It's the last time Bruno ever held the championship. And he lost in Baltimore. And, so from that point on, Bruno was always like the champion of my childhood. But the Zbyszko thing, right? Like that whole storyline in Pittsburgh, that was like a Pittsburgh story, right? As much as anything.
Yeah, no doubt. Look, everything involving Bruno and the community is Pittsburgh. I mean, other than the Italian part of it, but it's all here, and that's what made him so special here.
For him being around town and stuff there, I guess over the last 30 years, he really left the spotlight, right? I mean, from the wrestling side of things, he didn't have a whole lot to do with wrestling. I'd had him booked at one point to come in and never materialized because we didn't sell enough tickets to do like an Italian dinner. And I think for people of that era, and they're passing on now, there's a few of us left that sort of grew up idolizing a Bruno Sammartino. I think he sort of marveled at how big wrestling became, right? Like that it went from becoming this regional thing where guys got in their car and drove from Maine to Boston to New York to Pennsylvania where they did their tapings. And, Bruno was rarely involved in those tapings, especially in the late 70s and into the 80s because he had done all the road work and he had kind of a special relationship with McMahon to get McMahon over, right? Like he was the first guy to sort of fight back against McMahon and get special terms to a contract, right? He negotiated his deals back in the day.
Yeah, he had that type of power, that type of leverage, and one part of it was that where, he didn't want to enter into that swearing part of it to where they'd come out and be doing that or having the women, around. So all that bothered him. And when I say women around in the wrestling ring, prancing around with very little clothes on, it just wasn't the way that he was brought up. And, again, he's an old Italian from over in Italy and, coming over, it just the way that he was brought up. And look, the guy was special in the community. I would see him. You're right. He did go away. He knew that he was getting beat up, but I'd see him at, say, the Dapper Dan banquet or other things. But it always had that crowd around him, no matter what. He'd always still come out. If he'd see you, he'd come over and walk to you. I mean, that's just the way he was, the way that he operated. In the community, he just did so much good. If we were able to translate a lot of the things that he did into our professional athletes, and by the way, and he always, he was a believer, obviously, in our country and in the flag, and That was always strong with him. And I don't know how he'd be responding to certain events that are going on today, but he was an old timer. But if you were to use one word to describe him, aside from his wrestling abilities and championships, it would be decent. The man he was just a good man. You could see just from everybody who celebrated him, and we were fortunate to have him in Pittsburgh.
Well, and you know what? You were an NFL player, and you played with good guys, and you played with bad guys back in the 70s at college, at the NFL level, and then you became an agent. And when you're an agent, it was much more that you only wanted to have the good guys around you, right? And you only wanted to I see the type of people you represent. Mike Flynn and I are very, very close. He was just here this weekend with his boy playing ball up in Aberdeen at Ripken Stadium, at Jeff Saturday. And these quality human beings, the kind of people you want to be. Bruno was the kind of guy you wanted to represent. He was the first-round draft pick that you wanted to see cross the stage in Dallas this week and get a cap and have a 15-year NFL career. But, I guess for you with the NFL draft thing, I want to bring this to light because the draft is going on right now. What is your advice when you give to these guys, having seen this evolve over 50 years during this draft period? We see all these guys, they all have a story now. They all don't just have an agent, they have a brand, right? Like, in a way, when you're trying to create a brand for Fralic 40 years ago, every one of these kids knows what a brand is. It's so much different now than even what it was back when we drafted Ray Lewis in Ogden, which feels like 5 minutes ago around here, but it's been 23 years as Ozzie has his last draft here this week, right?
Yes. There's a lot in there. When Ozzie and what they've done there in the organization, I think has been exceptional. I always compare Baltimore to the Pittsburgh Steelers. I just, you see the consistency there in the ownership, and that's where it starts. And then, with the head coach, which you lucked out on, and we're able to get in a championship quarterback, and both the Steelers and the Colts have to replace that, or excuse me, the Ravens. I apologize. I go back.
You're old school. It's okay. You're allowed to throw the blue and white flag. That's a badge of honor around here, Cindrich. You start referring to our team as the Colts these days,
Well, yes. And hey, I've been banged in the head a little bit. Wrestling has a higher rate of CTE than does football by a Northwestern study in 2016. So that was collegiate wrestling.
My dear friend John Stedman, the Hall of Famer, would call you a young old timer, is what he would call you.
Yes. But I rest on the people. Look, I didn't have the personality. I wasn't a BSer or a salesman. In that sense, you may disagree, or someone may disagree. But I've
met Drew Rosenhaus, so yes, I understand what you're talking about. Yes.
Thank you. And where your word is something, and to where you conduct yourself in a certain manner. But I was a throwdown guy too. Having been a football player and a wrestler, there weren't too many people, including Ozzie, that I wasn't willing to throw down with, and that goes a long way in the football world with all the testosterone that goes on there. But it's something that a man can feel from a man across from him. But I had guys who were just quality, primarily because I didn't pay the money. There's never been, and there's certain things you can say out there that you can impeach someone on. You can't impeach me on. I never paid money. I never broke the rules. Because I was too stupid. I didn't know. I knew that if I broke the rules, I would be immediately caught like I was in everything else that I did wrong in my life. I was caught and punished, sometimes severely. I played it straight up. That's not to wear that on my sleeve, but I needed good guys. And you're right. When you look at the quality of the people that I worked with, they were just exceptional. But I also was kind of a hard butt when it came to negotiations and holdouts. And so I needed a guy that wasn't going to fold on me. The guys that are bought all folded. They talk tough and then they would fold. The guys that aren't bought, that go in there and believe in actually what you're doing and the reasons why, you can do a lot of things.
He is Ralph Cindrich. The book is NFL Brawler, Player Turned Agents 40 Years in the Bloody Trenches of the NFL. You can follow him on Twitter for insights about Bruno Sammartino, the Steelers, agentry, the NFL, or just whatever's on his mind. This is the last thing for you, Ralph. I don't think I'm coming to Pittsburgh this week for the playoffs. I did come last year. I was really, I don't want to say shocked, right? And I know you have some ties to Mario Lemieux. And when I think of Pittsburgh, there's guys like you. And you know I'm close with Coach Tomlin up there, who's a bit of a transplant, in and out. They've been trying to run him out of there as well. But the Pittsburgh Penguins as a brand, having gone in there and lived there for 4 days last year and seen a couple of those games and gone back, what a brand they've built there, off of Lemieux and now off of Sidney Crosby. And we're going to throw down here over the next week and a half. And I know every Caps fan will say we know how this ends around here, and you can take your cheap shot ahead of them. One year we're going to beat the Penguins. This might be it might not. I don't know. But the Penguins have built something there that they were close to not being there anymore at one point, or 2 points, right?
Mario holds in this city the same respect as the Rooney family. When you talk, it doesn't get any higher. What he's done for this city in that manner, and he really deserves all the credit. I didn't represent him or anything, but I did buy his house. He had a custom built house in Mount Lebanon, and it had his initials up where the steeple is, and carved out in stone. And no, I didn't take it down. I left those initials up there until I moved out after a period of time, and now live in downtown Pittsburgh.
ML could stand for Mount Lebanon, or it could stand for My Life, right? There's a lot of things it could stand for, right?
And yeah, without question. And so we talk about that in this city, how blessed we are to have that ownership with the Steelers and with the hockey, and unfortunately not with baseball. But 2 out of 3. Ain't bad.
Yeah, but Meatloaf made a little bit of money on that song on the Bat Out of Hell album. Ralph Cindrich can be found at Ralph Cindrich out on Twitter. Hey, man, always appreciate you circling back with me. Sometimes takes a little longer, but it makes the stories even better. And they say the tales grow taller on down the line. But the Bruno Sammartino legend, did you see the Andre piece a couple weeks ago on HBO?
I did not, but I'm a fan of Andre.
You should go check that out. Bill Simmons did a hell of a job, and it led me to start talking with Alex Marvez and some people that know football and wrestling, and Gary Michael Capetta, and telling some old Andre the Giant stories. But there aren't a whole lot of people that can tell Bruno stories so much anymore, because Bruno was to himself and in Pittsburgh, and I'm glad you could share a couple of them, because I will always be a fan of Bruno. He's one of my first heroes, and to lose him, I wanted to talk about it. I didn't have anybody to talk about, Ralph, so I'm glad you had a little time and gave us some great stories, man. The orangutan, I won't forget that one.
well, thank you. And being from Pittsburgh, if I'm not one. To me, if a guy's an SOB alive, he's an SOB when he dies. This guy was just top flight. The best. We were so blessed in Pittsburgh to have him for so many years. Well,
everybody says that, so it's sort of universal. He must have been a hell of a dude. He was certainly great to us. Ralph, take care, man. Happy hockey season to you, draft season, and pretty soon we'll be coming up there looking to slobber knock you guys around at Heinz Field. I'm sure on some cold, windy night with Ben Roethlisberger, and someone will have to kick a field goal or something, right?
Hey, no doubt about it. But boy, what a great rivalry.
Wouldn't want it any other way.
Love it.
It would be fun to watch you guys become the Browns for the next 30 years, but I'm just saying. Ralph, be good, man. There he goes. Ralph Cindrich up in Pittsburgh with Yins and At. You can follow him at Ralph Cindrich. Go read his book. He's a fun follow, and certainly a wise old sage in the industry of being an agent, and an old Houston Aller, too, which probably didn't sit well up in Pittsburgh. Nasty at WNST.net. Can find me anytime, anywhere the internet is served. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.